Any questions for the group? Don't be shy.
I had a question for Mr. Gonzalez regarding the inventory of farmland and why it wasn't included when you looked at forestation or the forest. Why isn't farmland, specifically trees, included in that inventory?
As you saw from another of our presentations, nitrous oxide, a lot of the emissions from farmland required a more detailed analysis of the processes. Most of the emissions in the forest and other wildlands come from stock change, and it's more straightforward. We don't require a process-based model. So we recognize the limitations of our approach by segregating out the farmland. And as far as the urban areas, we don't yet have good remote sensing data on trees and other vegetation in urban areas. That's the subject of another research effort. So we look at the 83% of the state that contain the majority of ecosystem carbon.
Question for Mark Fisher. Your carbon emission data showed these big peaks at about the start of the year, and it seemed like, I mean, as they went up and down, right? I mean, it sounded like it made good sense. In the wintertime, you're burning a whole lot more natural gas heating, and then in the summertime it goes down. Do you think that's the cause of the wintertime peaks?
Thank you for asking the question. If I could politely correct the observation, the pictures that I was showing were, I think, for the time series, not actually emissions over time, but those were the enhancements of various different gases in the atmosphere over time, measured near the surface, from a tower. And one of the things that occurs as part of the sort of annual cycle of atmospheric transport is that in the winter when it's colder, the boundary layer that traps the emissions from the surface is lower, and so it leads to effectively a smaller test tube into which you're putting either the same, more or less, but a smaller test tube resulting in a higher concentration. And so what you're seeing there are concentration enhancements that are in general greater in the winter just because of the height of the boundary layer. I think that's a zeroth order way of understanding it, but let's talk about it more later and we can...
So basically, have you been able to identify the seasonal variations from California sources?
I could say a little bit more, offline, but, in short, the seasonal variations in methane, nitrous oxide, and fossil fuel CO2 are broadly consistent with our sort of prior understanding of the processes that are leading to those emissions. So I mentioned in the talk nitrous oxide emissions ranging sort of over a 25% variation over a seasonal cycle due to a mixture of changing nutrient application, water availability in the soil, and temperature. And I think Bill could probably speak in much greater detail and with more authority about the processes that are driving that.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentations. This is probably for Bill. I'm interested in the role of wetlands. You talked about manure and dairies and so forth, and Mr. Fisher alluded that you might address wetlands. I wondered if you could characterize the impact of wetlands on greenhouse gas emissions in general, and especially nitrous oxide and methane.
So I'll talk about it from the agriculture perspective. We have not studied natural wetlands. From from an ag perspective, so let's use rice as an example. Actual N2O emissions from rice agroecosystems are quite low because they're continuously flooded systems. So the systems become very anaerobic. If you go back to that slide that I showed the redox dynamics, they become anaerobic and hence no longer production of nitrous oxide, but production of methane, because the only available oxygen at that point is organic carbon. Lagoon systems or liquid manure management systems, again, depends on the type of system and how anaerobic they become. So, again, large, very effluent lagoons are going to be a very small source of N2O production. It will be a source of methane emissions. So in general, liquid management of manure or flooded agroecosystems have very low nitrous oxide emissions because the nitrogen that's denitrified goes all the way to N2 because it becomes very anaerobic. So there's no nitrate available as a substrate to produce N2O. So methane is the main source from agroecosystems that have wetland systems or anaerobic-based systems involved.
I was just going to add that it's one thing to be clear on when we talk about these top-down methods or using atmospheric measurements and comparing them with inventory-derived estimates, is you have to be careful what I call the apples and oranges effect. Inventories don't include all sources in sinks. They include the ones that are defined in guidelines, IPCC guidelines. There are some sectors which are not included in the inventories because they're, quote, purely natural. Now, we can argue about what's natural, but there are conventions in what's in some of these things we talk about, like natural wetlands, are not necessarily included in state-level inventories. So part of the thing we have to do as researchers when we're teasing these things apart to make sure we're at least comparing apples and pears, not apples and pomegranates. It's complicated.
If I could add a little bit to what Bill said, there are other estimates and ongoing work specifically addressing the net carbon balance of wetland restoration in the Sacramento River Delta. In particular, they're probably more widely spaced as well. And some of those are quite direct measurements on sort of plot scales that are looking at methane. And I could say a little bit more about that offline. But there are people here at the University of California who are addressing that problem.
Bud Beebe with SMUD. Recently, the state of California completely recalibrated its whole public inventory of greenhouse gases based on the global warming potential change in methane. And that was the specific piece. From my perspective, I think it went pretty well. The whole thing happened. I didn't see a whole lot of media coverage and, oh my God, the scientists were wrong all along and those kinds of things. I'd like some of your reflections. How do you think that went? And have you had people attacking the science just because we had to recalibrate? And do you think the data sets before, the data sets after, and so forth remain sound? I'll put it that way, I guess. That's the first two questions.
We have a volunteer.
Yeah, so I have had to answer a lot of questions from members of the public over time, and that question has never come up.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. People generally ask about when are we going to switch to the next version of IPCC global warming potential. They don't ask why are you choosing this or that. More in the line of we want to be consistent with national and also international reporting of greenhouse gas, and the current GWP, which is the fourth assessment report from IPCC, is the one that everybody is using. So we want to be consistent with them. Fortunately, nobody has questioned the science on that aspect, so we're just sticking with what IPCC, which we consider as a gold standard in climate change science in this regard.
Then for a second whole question, for a decade, the official greenhouse gas emissions inventory from electrical generation facilities has been using simple multipliers on the carbon dioxide piece to find both the N2O and the methane contribution. I'm not suggesting that we should go back and have all power plants suddenly measure for both of those constituents and report them. I think that the use of multipliers is probably a good one for that particular piece and those emissions. But the power plants have changed over the last 10 years, and they'll change just a little bit more as we replace some of the current stock, particularly the old boilers, with combined cycle units. Is there some thought that you'll modify those simple multipliers?
Are you talking about emission factors?
Yes.
Okay, so emission factor is assuming a complete combustion of fuel, so it's just a carbon mass balance. So as power plants get more efficient, they burn less fuel to produce more megawatt hour. That will actually be accounted for using a complete mass balance of carbon emission.
Yes, but still well, how did you get more efficient? Did you get more efficient by reducing the amount of excess unburnt methane? Or did you? No, of course not. But and the N2O piece. I mean, that's got to be a function both of what's in the fuel, which might change, but it's also got to be a function of temperatures and pressures and residence times. And they're going to be different in the newer power plant set than they were in the old power plant set. Is there any thought that you're going to be changing the basic multipliers?
So the methane emissions, if you look at the total emissions from a power plant, methane emissions is a very small portion of the total emission in CO2 equivalent. Of course, we're always looking out for new study and new testing and new data that could help inform that change. But for now, since it's a very small portion, that will not have a higher priority as some of the larger sources. We want to make sure that we want to gain more accuracy in our estimation.
Okay, so you're comfortable, I'm comfortable, that's where we're leaving it. Right.
And we're using the US EPA Part 98 emission factor too.
Thanks. So I think I have another question for Patrick Gonzalez about the modeling for natural land carbon flux. And kind of the punchline from the presentation was that your big emissions are coming from fire. You have these large pulses from fairly stochastic emissions. And for me, that raises the question, you acknowledged that, fire is part of a natural process here in California and needs to be part of our ecology and sort of our carbon flux baseline. Have you given any thought to how to sort of better draw out what the natural background emissions of fire are in California? And do you think that the model is better at capturing those emissions than necessarily the finer points of growth on the remaining part of the landscape that hasn't burned, particularly in some of those older, larger size classes that are a lot of variability in the satellite imagery?
Great, thanks for your question. So our method quantified both the growth and the losses to fire. So if you remember, I have a map. It had green and brown. About 14% of the wildland area we found growth, and it was on the wildfire areas were the ones that were mainly brown, and it just overwhelmed the natural growth. Within that, I need to make a precision that our approach is not a model. We did not model. We're actually trying to use an empirical approach to quantify what has happened historically. About wildfire, you asked if we could somehow, if I understand your question, if we could somehow discriminate between a natural background fire emissions and what else?
Well, just that when the information is presented, it suggests that, you know, this roughly 70 million tons a year are emissions that are, you know, going to be bad. But some significant portion of that, if not all of that, would be as part of the natural ecological balance in California.
Okay. Yes, okay. So again, to summarize, we're living right now with a legacy of unnatural fire suppression of approximately a century of fire fuels, both dead and live, that had natural processes been allowed to proceed, probably would not be there. So it's the question is not really teasing out a natural fire. We have a situation that's the product of natural and human processes. The question is now looking forward under climate change. Climate change is changing that ecologically appropriate fire baseline, what you say natural, ecologically appropriate fire. So fire management in national parks and other protected areas has been trying to get fire back to a level pre-European settlement, 1849. Well, we'll never be able to get to that level. In fact, under climate change, it's raising whatever that ecologically appropriate fire regime is. So the question is, can we manage fire in this interim period so we promote natural fire, tolerate a short-term pulse of carbon, and get to that point where we get to a more natural fire regime where you have a net storage rather than a net emission, a net storage in large, late zero class, older trees. So that's a challenge. And to discriminate among fires, it would be easy in our method to do that if you have fires that were ignited by a car or fires that were ignited by lightning. We could do that.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and the presenters are going to be around, so you can tap into them later, but we're getting dangerously close to lunch. So one more question.
Thank you. This is for William Salas. Actually, I was just really interested in, particularly in thinking about the agricultural issues. By the way, I'm Hannah from Sherrod Marin, and so I'm thinking more from a community perspective. And I'm really curious about the implications of the research that you and others are doing about agricultural emissions and how it relates to the research that's also being done on carbon sequestration and the ability to, understand those dynamics of all those emissions going up. How do they allow us to understand more about how to get them down? Thank you.
So I'll address that briefly, and then we can have maybe a more in-depth discussion because it's quite complex. The interactions between the production of greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide from agroecosystems, and changes in carbon stocks, whether it be changes in the vegetation carbon stocks or organic material in the soils. Because, as I mentioned, that the soil conditions have a significant influence on the production of greenhouse gas emissions. Because it influences how much of the microbial populations can be supported based on the availability of energy. So there's a feedback between the carbon dynamics in the soils and the production of these greenhouse gas emissions. So as we look at strategies for managing nitrogen, from an N2O perspective, we need to also consider the feedbacks on soil carbon. And I think that's why we look at mechanistic models to understand those issues. Because typically, field studies or limited budgets, they focus on a component of the system, N2O or rice methane. How does that affect the whole entire system? Where we're looking at soil carbon dynamics, we're looking at vegetation, carbon storage, we're looking at trace gas emissions. One example is going to no-till, and this is more an issue for the Midwest, where you increase soil organic matter in the soils. That's a good thing. You're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, storing it in the soils. However, you can create conditions and improve the production of N2O. And so your benefits in carbon sequestration can be overwhelmed actually by increased production in N2O. So we need to look at these as a systems approach when we begin to look at sort of baseline inventories and approaches for looking at mitigation. And I think that's where process models have an advantage. Again, they need to be well validated and calibrated with field measurements to understand how well they're performing.